I'm Leilani Farha. I am the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. In my role, I act as a kind of global watchdog. I monitor whether governments the world over are meeting their international human rights obligations in the area of housing. The right to adequate housing under international human rights law is not a complicated thing. It's simply the right to live somewhere in peace, security, and with dignity. Living on the streets, or in a place that is unaffordable, or that has no water, or no good water, that is generally not adequate, does not meet the conditions under international human rights law. When I present on homelessness and inadequate housing, for me, it's really essential that I focus on people, the human beings that are experiencing the phenomenon. And I always try to make sure that they're present with us. And I understand that there are probably some people in this room with lived experience of homelessness, or maybe who are homeless right now. And I'm hoping that the projection will come up and that we'll be joined by a few others. In fact, I'd like to start by just talking about a few people. These are just a few people. They're people I've met on my travels, and I have a feeling that you've probably met them too. The stories I'm going to tell are not the worst stories. They're just a few stories, everyday stories. So let's talk about Peter. I met Peter at a drop-in center here in the US. Peter is gay. He's a white man in his 50s, physically disabled. He uses a walker to get around. Peter is poor, and he has severe asthma or another respiratory issue, and may have some kind of a psychosocial disability. I'm not sure how he ended up on the streets, but he's been displaced several times recently as part of the city sweeps where he lives. Peter told me this story. It was a hot day, and he needed some groceries. With no means of transportation and not wanting to spend money on the bus, he walked to the store. After buying his groceries, he was pretty tired, so, he has a respiratory illness. So before making the trek back to where he was staying, he took a break to catch his breath, and he sat down on the sidewalk on his walker. A couple of minutes later, a police officer approached him and told him that resting on a sidewalk was prohibited and asked him to move along. At considerable risk to his own health, Peter had no choice but to do so or suffer the consequences of a fine or further harassment and even possible imprisonment. Let's talk about Cassandra, an African-American woman in her 50s, single mother. She was working at a medical clinic when I met her. She had a decent job, making just above minimum wage. She had been paying $1,200 a month for a one-bedroom apartment until her building was bought by a multinational asset management firm. Her rent was immediately increased by 30%. She knew she wouldn't be able to afford it, so she moved out. She couch surfed with a friend. And then when she felt she had outstayed her welcome, she wanted to move in with her sister, but she couldn't because her sister had taken in her mother, who also had no place to live. So I met Cassandra where she now lives, in a tent under a highway, struggling to find a place to take a shower and wash her clothes so that she can keep her job. She said the tent encampment was threatened with eviction, and from there, she had no idea where she would end up. And then there's the African-American woman I spotted, whose name I don't know, who I saw sitting on a stool outside of her tent. She was plucking her eyebrows and putting on the day's makeup. All of this I saw, and much, much more, on a single trip to California, one of the richest places on the planet, with the 5th largest GDP globally, larger than that of the United Kingdom. These three short stories, these lived moments, in my opinion, tell us pretty much everything we need to know to both diagnose what's broken and to come up with some remedies. Let's begin with the diagnosis. First, these stories tell me that we are living in cruel times. Cruel by any standards, but let's take the dictionary definition. Willfully causing pain or suffering to others or feeling no concern about it. Yes, we are living in cruel times. In the richest country in the world, homelessness has become normalized. Those who are homeless are rendered invisible. They are at once ignored and targets of policies that make them disappear, swept, cleaned, and moved out of what are increasingly becoming sanitized, corporatized cities. Take a walk around this neighborhood. You'll know what I'm talking about. Homelessness in an affluent country should provoke outrage, and it has. But the outrage provoked by homelessness has been directed toward homeless people themselves, rather than towards the laws, policies, and decision makers who have enabled it. The second thing these stories suggest is that homelessness is a product of prosperity, not decline. I read that in a tweet today and I really liked that phrase. Homelessness is a product of prosperity, not decline. The new face of homelessness in the US and elsewhere are those of people who are working, young people with families, people with children. We know that there isn't a single county in the US where someone on minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom rental apartment. Not a single county in the US. I would argue that the unaffordability of housing, which is significantly contributing to this new face of homelessness, is rooted in the financialization of housing, or I might say residential real estate. And by financialization, I mean that housing is now valued as a commodity rather than as a human dwelling. It is now a means to secure and accumulate wealth rather than a place to live in dignity, to raise a family and thrive within a community. Housing has become security for financial instruments, traded and sold on global markets. And I'm not talking here about mom and pop investors or even the person who buys a home and flips it. This is of a different order. The pace and extent to which financial corporations and pension and hedge funds are taking over housing and real estate and causing homelessness, displacement, and unaffordability is staggering. Residential real estate is the biggest business of all businesses in the world. It is valued at $163 trillion, and your head should be shaking because you don't know what $163 trillion is. No one does. It is 2.5 times the total world's GDP. That is the value of residential real estate. Banks, pension and hedge funds, private equity firms, and other kinds of financial intermediaries seek out housing, and particularly housing they have deemed to be undervalued and capable of more profits, and they park their capital there. They often benefit from tax shelters and use a lack of transparency to provide cover for anonymous investors and capital gained through corruption. This influx of capital has increased housing prices, including for rental accommodation, in many cities to levels that most residents simply cannot afford, in some cities by more than 50% in a short period. Housing prices are no longer commensurate with household income levels, and instead are driven by demand for housing assets amongst global investors. When housing prices skyrocket, people like Cassandra and Peter are forced out of their communities by high rents. And of course, in this country, there is a deep racial element to all of this. The stories I told you also expose the governments, or I should say governments, plural, all levels of government, their dual role in this. What's always noticeable to me when I hear these stories is the absence of government, or when government appears, it's in this aggressive role. There is no government accountability for the homelessness crisis. How and where are governments being held accountable? I ask you that. Maybe a few court cases that we often lose. Governments have established laws and policies and structures and systems that create homelessness. And then, once they create it, at best, they provide limited resources to address it, mostly as a matter of charity, where only the most basic of needs might be met, with no intention of dismantling the structures and systems that have caused homelessness in the first place. And at worst, as I've already said, governments actively dehumanize and criminalize those who are homeless, enacting and enforcing move-along laws, no camping laws, no sleeping in car laws, fining people for urinating or defecating or sleeping or resting on streets, fining people for providing food for those who are living on the streets, evicting people, destroying their property. I could go on and on. I think you all know what I'm talking about. The last thing that I think these stories tell us, and this is really essential from a human rights point of view, I think these stories tell us a lot about human dignity. Think of the humiliation and assault on dignity when you're told you can't rest on a sidewalk, when you're forced to move out of your own home at age 50 and asking your friends or relatives if you can couch surf, or living in a tent encampment without a shower or a toilet. Think of that woman, and I often do, plucking her eyebrows on the side of a road, putting on her makeup, clinging to her dignity. It's this last point that puts homelessness squarely in the domain of human rights. Ask yourself, what are human rights really about in their essence? Human rights are only about one thing: protecting and preserving dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the basis of all human rights, recognizes in its preamble that the inherent dignity and the equal rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Homelessness most definitely triggers dignity interests. And in light of the nature and extent of homelessness globally, there is little doubt in my mind that it represents one of the most widespread and significant human rights issues of our time. And human rights issues, of course, demand human rights responses. Before I discuss that in more detail, I want you to know, I've focused on the US so far, but I want you to know that what you're experiencing here in the US with respect to homelessness, while definitely extreme, especially in light of your resources, it is part of a global phenomenon. Homelessness is on the rise in every country in the world except Finland. Let's zoom out and take a look at the global picture. Worldwide, there are 1.8 billion people, 1.8 billion people living in inadequate housing and homelessness. And as you all know all too well, homelessness is deadly. And an estimated 1/3 of deaths worldwide are linked to poverty and inadequate housing and homelessness. As you also know well, the death rate among homeless people ranges from 2 to 10 times higher than for those who are not homeless, sometimes even more. In other words, the life expectancy of someone without a home is much shorter than those with a home. The world over, homeless people are seen as dirty, lacking morals, and as burdens on society. They are often subject to sexual violence and violence based in hate. They are denied access to water and sanitation and criminalized and stigmatized and discriminated against for engaging in activities necessary for life, such as eating and sleeping in public spaces. Homeless people have told me often, and often through tears, that more than any material security, what they yearn for is to be seen, to be recognized and treated by society as human beings with inherent dignity and respect. They are asking for human rights. And yet, despite the fact that there are homeless people on the streets throughout the world, despite the fact that homelessness occurs in all economies, developed, emerging, and developing, in times of prosperity and in times of austerity, and despite the fact that homelessness is a significant economic and social cost for most societies, it has not been taken up as a critical human rights crisis that needs to be resolved in domestic contexts or internationally. So, I'm often asked, well, what would it mean, or what difference would it make if we were to treat homelessness as a human rights matter? Let me tell you. It would mean recognizing, first of all, that homelessness is a violation of the right to adequate housing. That is, and I repeat, the right to live somewhere in dignity and with security. And that it is a violation of other rights, like the right to health, like the right to life, and the right to be free from cruel and inhuman treatment. That homelessness is a representation of government's failure to implement those human rights. That's what homelessness is. You have to think about what I just said. That's an important, complete shift. Homelessness is about the failure by governments to implement the right to adequate housing and other human rights. Human rights change the way governments must interact with people who are homeless and inadequately housed. It recognizes them not as beneficiaries of charity or handouts or benevolence, but rather as rights holders, active subjects, empowered to engage and be involved in decisions that affect their own lives. A rights-based approach to homelessness clarifies who is accountable to whom. Governments are accountable to homeless people, and they have to start showing up. There are very specific obligations on governments under international human rights law in this regard, and these include homelessness must be treated with the highest urgency as a matter of life and death. Governments have an immediate obligation to adopt and implement strategies to eliminate homelessness, which include clear goals and timelines in consultation with those who are homeless. And note, I said eliminate homelessness, not reduce. Governments must combat discrimination, stigma, and negative stereotyping of homeless people as also a matter of urgency, and provide legal protections for such. Evictions should never render an individual homeless, and there should be a prohibition on any eviction that would have that result. Every government decision or policy should be consistent with eliminating homelessness. That includes all of those decisions that are being made by departments of finance, by tax regulators and tax lawyers. Have to engage the private sector to ensure that their actions and policies are in accordance with the right to adequate housing and the prevention of homelessness. That means engaging private equity firms like Blackstone, the largest landlord in the US, to ensure that their policies are not contributing to homelessness. What distinguishes a human rights-based approach also is that human rights claims identify the structural and systemic barriers to the realization of the right to housing. This forces us to view, as I said already, homelessness differently. It means we'd have to start viewing every homeless person as someone who suffers not just because of their individual circumstances, but also as a result of broader systemic and institutional factors. It would mean that when everyday people walk by a homeless person who's on the street, rather than feeling nothing, or feeling threatened or disgusted, or rather than feeling even maybe sympathetic, a human rights approach would have us feel some kind of outrage. Outrage at the failure of governments to implement their human rights obligations. So, it's a big question. How can we move our governments to embrace a completely different understanding of homelessness? How can we effect what I think is a paradigmatic shift away from criminalization or charitable models to a human rights model? Well, my theory of change is based on what I've seen the world over. It's only once we recognize that change is needed, only once we try to change within ourselves, and only once we start speaking up and speaking out, and only once we start doing that with unusual allies, will change come about. So, here's my little list for you. Let's see how it goes over. You're going to take me down after this, I have a feeling, but let's see. As service providers, some of you I think are probably service providers, whether you're doctors or nurses or working in a community clinic of some sort. Check what I've said today here against your own interactions with those who are homeless. Do you recognize those with whom you work as rights holders, as entitled to something more, as entitled to long-term adequate housing options with supportive services if necessary? I want you, as in your roles, to start revisioning yourselves. If you're working with people who are homeless, consider yourself a human rights administrator or a human rights defender. Recognize then that you too have something at stake here. As human rights administrators or defenders, you can help to identify the structures, the systems, the laws and policies that are in place that are impeding right to adequate housing and its enjoyment by people who are marginalized and vulnerable. Use your privilege, your relative positions of power, to make change. On a more individual level, ask yourself questions that you might not have asked yourself before. For example, there might be some people in the room who are lucky enough to be paying into a pension fund. I'm not one of those people. Inquire with your union or your pension fund whether pension funds are going into investments into residential real estate in your city that is then contributing to driving up the cost of housing, forcing people out and onto the streets. Start asking public officials why the right to housing isn't included in legislation in your state or in your city. And if you're a public official yourself, start becoming part of the solution. Let me just close with this. More than 550,000 homeless people in a country with the largest GDP in the world is not acceptable. It's shameful. So I'm asking each of you, just before you go to that rally, to find your outrage. Recognize homelessness as the human rights violation that it is. Hold your governments accountable. And don't accept the unacceptable.